Today is episode 106 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Emily Dufton. She's the author of Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America. This was published just last year by Basic Books. Before we get into today's episode, we're going to do our monthly book raffle. If you want to participate in the book raffle, you should donate to our Patreon. The winner of the raffle will have a choice of one of three books. This month's winner was Callum Milne. We will get in touch with Callum to let him know, and we will be offering one of the following books. The first book we'll be offering today will be Grassroots, the book I just mentioned by our guest today, Dr. Emily Dufton, and it is a history of marijuana and marijuana policy in the United States, which we'll get into in far more detail in the podcast itself. The second book on offer today will be Marc Bloch. I'm butchering his name, I'm sure, but his book, The Historian's Craft. Marc Bloch is a French historian from the first half of the 20th century. He was part of the Annales School, which was a French school of historiography which tried to do much more social history and a little less political history. And he wrote this book shortly before he joined the French Resistance. He was a Jewish historian, and he went underground and joined the resistance to fight the Nazis during World War II after France was occupied, and ended up being killed by the Nazis after several successful years doing fighting against them as part of the underground. The book itself is Bloch's attempt to explain methodology of how history should be written, how history should be studied, and is pretty accessible. So if you've ever wanted a book on the methodology of history, it's a really great place to start. The final book on offer today is a historical novel by novelist Mario Vargas Llosa. The book is The Feast of the Goat. In Spanish, La Fiesta del Chivo. It's available in English and Spanish. The book itself is a historical novel about the final days of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic from the 1930s into the early 1960s. And the book follows a series of different individuals who are actual historical figures, and what they did during his final days ruling over the Dominican Republic. It is an excellent novel, and it is a really great way to break into the history of the Dominican Republic. With that said, let's start the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're here with Dr. Emily Dufton. She's an independent writer and historian based in D.C., and she graduated from the George Washington University with a PhD in American Studies. Emily, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Great to have you. Before we start, there's a couple questions I always ask our guests. What first got you interested in history?
Oh, a lot of things. I mean, I was always kind of a person driven by narrative, I guess, and I was always interested in knowing what had happened before that had gotten us to this point. So I think by the sheer fact that I was always interested in storytelling and I guess the sort of width and breadth of human nature and human history, that was, I fell into it because it seemed like the most logical place for me.
That's great. And do you have, let's say, not necessarily related to your field, but let's say an author that particularly inspired you or got interested in this?
Oh, yes, absolutely. What particularly drove me into drug history was the book by Martin Torgoff called Can't Find My Way Home, America in the Great Stone Age, 1945 to 2000. I picked that book up my senior year of college, which was actually my senior year since I graduated a year early. And I found it in a Barnes & Noble near campus, and it just like called to me from across the room. I picked it up. I think I read it in about 2 days. I was totally fascinated by how Torgoff had told the history of the second half of America's 20th century in terms of drug use and the effects that it had and how it changed American culture and how it changed American politics. I ate that book up. And I remember giving it to people like I was like an evangelist for Martin Torgoff's book. Like, here, you have to read this. It's so good. So that was the book that really inspired me. But because he didn't devote a lot of time to the parent movement, the anti-marijuana movement in the 1970s and 80s that really influenced how the Reagan administration executed its war on drugs, that was ultimately where I got the idea for my dissertation. I thought, there might be more to this particular story, the anti-drug movement that people like Martin Torgoff and some other drug historians who I read and adored hadn't quite touched into. And that was the basis for my historical examination.
Interesting. So, before we begin, today we're going to be talking about the legalization or attempts to legalize marijuana in the United States. But before we get to that, we should probably ask when and why marijuana became illegal in the first place.
Well, it's a great question. And it kind of became illegal in multiple stages. Starting in the 19th century, marijuana or cannabis was fairly accessible. It was, widely used in tinctures that could be found in local corner pharmacies. Mothers would use it to soothe the aching gums of teething infants. People would use it to calm pain or cramps or things like that. Starting in 1906 with the progressive movement, the Pure Food and Drug Act started tamping down on things that were considered essentially narcotics in widely available medications that didn't require a prescription. The act required producers to accurately label what was in the things that they were selling. So cannabis tinctures slowly kind of fell out of favor. At the same time, the drug was being, one might say, exported from Mexico to the United States through the widespread immigration of Mexicans who were fleeing the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and coming into the Southwest United States. So naturally, because the United States is what it is, it began basically racializing and really targeting the drug as something that was only being used by Mexicans, African Americans, and lower class whites, and making assumptions about drug use because of that. Assumptions about that specific drug use, I should say. So by the time the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act rolled around, which was a product very much from Harry Anslinger's Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and he was really opposed to marijuana, it didn't necessarily outlaw marijuana, but it required people who were growing and producing the drug to register with the government and pay a tax on it. So these were the sort of early moves toward criminalizing marijuana. But there were no significant and sort of outstanding federal laws against the drug until 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act was passed by Richard Nixon with the assistance of his Attorney General, John Mitchell. And they were really interested in creating those 5 schedules of drugs that I think we're probably all familiar with, 1 through 5, in decreasing order of medical utility and potential for abuse. And both Nixon and Mitchell pushed really hard to have marijuana labeled as a Schedule I drug, not necessarily because they believed it was such a harmful substance, but because so many of the people protesting against the Nixon administration, those young people who were protesting against Vietnam, or they're protesting for civil rights or women's rights, they were also smoking marijuana. And Nixon saw in it the potential to have these people arrested. You can be arrested for protesting, right? That's the First Amendment right. But if you were using a substance that was a Schedule 1 drug, that would be grounds for arrest. And so both Nixon and Mitchell worked very hard to lobby Congress to basically place marijuana in Schedule 1, at least temporarily, and they did. And of course, marijuana remains a Schedule 1 drug today. So that's sort of the abridged history of why marijuana remains illegal on the federal level, though of course, as we know, because they keep changing, it is not illegal necessarily on the state level, and that is the one place where laws continue to change.
And one last question before we really get into the meat of the episode. I've seen online that there are different types of... There's a kind of politics with how marijuana is named. Is there kind of supposedly calling it marijuana may have some kind of negative connotations because it sounds more foreign or something like that? That's intentional or something?
Yeah, there's definitely discussions about that. Some people really dislike using the term marijuana because they feel it has racist connotations because of that moment of exodus from Mexico to the United States in the turn of the 20th century. For the most part, people who prefer to use the word cannabis over marijuana do so because they're trying to, de-racialize the drug. Pot has so many names. I mean, I just called it pot, right? There's so many terms that are used to describe this substance. I understand and recognize why cannabis is the term that has the most popularity and support right now because it's sort of extricated from that sort of racialized past. But I don't think that marijuana is that inherently racialized. I don't think it's that tied to there's a lot of words that have really bad connotations to them. And for the most part, marijuana, I don't think is really one of them. There's a lot of people who who support the term marijuana. For the most part, if you don't use the spelling with an H rather than a J, which is very antiquated, not since the 1920s was that in common use. But I feel as though, I guess, there are larger debates and issues that we have to discuss over the use of this drug. And the name of it, because it goes by so many names, really shouldn't be the focus of our efforts. That's kind of where I come down.
I hear you. So, we've got a good background now to how it was criminalized and the actual terms that are used. What would you say are the origins of the movement to legalize it?
Oh, well, they have some fascinating and very specific origins. So the first, I guess, well-known sort of national movement to legalize occurred in August of 1964 when a 28-year-old young man named Lowell Eggemeyer walked into the San Francisco Hall of Justice, lit up a joint, and said, "I am starting a campaign to legalize marijuana smoking. I would like to be arrested." And he was, because marijuana was still a felony in California at the time. He actually spent a year in jail. But from his initial protest, an entire national movement formed. His attorney, who was representing him pro bono, was named James White, and he started the LEMAR movement, a contraction of legalized marijuana, which went national very quickly with the support of Allen Ginsberg. And within a couple of years, the legalization movement joined up with a series of youth movements that were happening at the time. It became a part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. It became a part of the civil rights movement. It became part of the feminist movement. It became a part of any movement that recognized that the federal government had the ability and the conviction to lie to its citizens, which most legalization proponents argued that it was currently doing with its feelings about marijuana. And it became basically a symbol of kind of protesting against everything that American culture stood for up to that point. It was a movement against the war. It was a movement against conformity. It was a movement against subjugation. It was a movement against racism. It was a movement against sexism. Marijuana became part of this larger movement in the 1960s to protest that which these young protesters felt was really disingenuous about American culture, and it became entirely tied to that as not only a symbolic action but as a political resolution as well.
Interesting. So, obviously, you've already touched on this, there being a difference, obviously, between trying to get it legalized on a federal level, but for those listeners who are not in the United States, we also have state laws, and while federal laws are superior in terms of jurisdiction, state laws, you'll often see, policies moving through states first. When did we start to see states becoming the main venue for this movement?
Just 3 years actually after it was outlawed federally. So the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, but by 1973, Oregon was the first state to actually decriminalize the personal possession of up to an ounce of marijuana. And they were working on the advice and recommendations of what became known as the Schaefer Commission, also known as the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, which the Controlled Substances Act organized as a 2-year study to figure out how Americans were using marijuana, what the relationship between the country's citizens and the drug was, and what the effects of the drug were on the populace at large. So by 1972, when the commission releases its report, they basically say, you know what? This is not our nation's biggest problem. That's actually heroin. The country was going through a heroin epidemic at the time as well. It's not something that we believe is a large social problem, and we think that the drug should be decriminalized, not legalized, but decriminalized on the state and federal level. Nixon's very unhappy with the results of this report, but individual states start to pick up on it. The report is actually widely available. It's a paperback book that costs like $1.25 or something. So it becomes this very widely understood, very available sort of publication, government publication, and it's dense and somewhat difficult to read. But the point of it was that pot wasn't that bad. So states start to pick up on it, starting in 73 with Oregon. And by 1978, a dozen states that incorporated about, a third of the entire United States population had decriminalized the possession of an ounce or less of marijuana, turning it from oftentimes a misdemeanor into little more than a civil fine. It was really a remarkable transformation that occurred in half a decade. It's crazy how rapidly the whole thing went.
And what about the regulation of paraphernalia and the like?
Well, there wasn't any. That's the thing about decrim as opposed to legalization, right? Decrim says that you can possess this drug, and if you get caught, you get a fine. But a whole world kind of sprouted up around decriminalized marijuana, selling legal substances that allowed, consumers to enjoy or indulge in an illegal substance. So pipes and bongs and rolling papers and toys and hiding places and grinders and scales and all this other stuff, they all became widely available. I mean, the economy of the 1970s wasn't great, right? We remember the gas lines and stagflation and all of that. But the one growth industry was paraphernalia. And it was huge. I mean, by 1977, it was a $250 million business, which in today's money is $1 billion. It was huge, right? It was the equivalent of what California is supposed to generate in taxes from legal marijuana sales this year. It was enormous. But because it was also completely unregulated with no sense of state or federal oversight, there were, head shops and record stores and things like that selling paraphernalia to kids. They weren't checking IDs. There were no bouncers in front of the stores, things like that. So sales of paraphernalia to children were fairly widely reported in the news, and rates of adolescent marijuana use also started to rise. By 1979, when they peaked in the United States, 11% of high school seniors reported smoking pot every day, and children as young as 13 reported that the drug was really easy to get. This sort of social transformation around marijuana resulted in rising rates of adolescent use, which was extremely problematic and motivational, I would say, for a rising number of parent activists who formed the first anti-marijuana counter-revolution in response.
From what you were saying, the movement to try to legalize it was tied up in a lot of the 1960s and 1970s counterculture. How present was the either, I don't know, model or concept or strategies used by folks during, for example, alcohol prohibition?
It was there, certainly. The same format, or I guess the same sort of prompt from Prohibition, was still present in the anti-marijuana movement. It wasn't present in the pro-legalization movement. Prohibition in the 1920s and prior to that, Carrie Nation, using her hatchet and going to saloons at the turn of the 20th century, she was really fighting for what was essentially the nuclear family, right? Like, she was arguing against alcohol because fathers were using their weekly wages to go to the saloon, and they were drinking it all up, and then they would come home and be terrible to their families and not support them. There was physical abuse reported. There was, all sorts of horrible things. So this idea of the sanctity and the need to preserve the structure of the nuclear family was very present in arguments for alcohol, or federal prohibition of alcohol, which occurred, of course, as we know, from 1920 to 1933. Those arguments were not at all, being used in the legalization or the decriminalization movement, I should say, in the 1970s, which instead argued that, for the most part, adults had the right to do what they wanted to in the privacy of their own homes, assuming they weren't hurting anyone else. And that was really key for the power and influence of this argument. You're talking about college kids, you're talking about taxpayers who are, honorably employed. You're talking about people who go home at the end of the day, and rather than having a drink of wine or whiskey or whatever, they want to light up a joint. That was the central figure of decriminalization arguments in the 1970s. We shouldn't incarcerate these people. We shouldn't punish these people. They're just regular American citizens. They pay their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. We should let them do what they want. They're not hurting anyone else. The problem was that conversation was turned on its head by these parent activists in the late 1970s and early 1980s, who said that an adult's right to access the intoxicant of their choice was nothing compared to a child's right to grow up drug-free. Essentially, because decriminalization had trickled down to the point where kids had easy access to this drug, adults couldn't be preserved of their right to access pot because it was becoming incredibly dangerous and detrimental to children's health. So a children's right to grow up drug-free became privileged, one might say, over an adult's right to do what they wanted to in the privacy of their own home.
And of the major political figures, let's say mainstream political figures, not just the counterculture movement, was there any specific individuals or any specific party that was kind of leaning further towards legalization, or they were both were kind of keeping it at kind of arm's length?
Oh, there were a ton of mainstream organizations that supported decriminalization, not legalization, but decriminalization. Immediately after the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, or the Schaefer Commission, released its report, the American Bar Association, the American Council of Churches, the National Consumer Rights Organizations, they all thought that, what the Schaefer Commission and what decriminalization and marijuana proponents were arguing was right on. I mean, they were basically saying, hey, consumers have a right to access this drug and not be arrested for it because they're purchasing it and they're not really doing any harm, and they're adults and they have the right to choose to do these things. We are criminalizing an entire class of people for no reason, and no good is going to come of it. So there was widespread, massive support for decrim in the 1970s that really reversed course as soon as Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and the country deviated from this 1960s-oriented path to return to its source of social conservatism throughout the 1980s, and one might argue onward.
And when, what really was this a kind of top-down movement that was very much articulated by a group of people within Reagan's administration, or would you say it was an organic movement that was already underway, and then the Reagan just kind of took it over?
Oh, 100% an organic grassroots movement that was already underway. The parent movement began in earnest in 1976 in Atlanta, Georgia. And so they had 4 years of organization under their belts before Reagan got elected. It was, for the most part, the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, who absorbed the parent movement's message and broadcast it to a national audience, primarily because she needed an image boost. When she first came into the White House, Nancy Reagan was deeply unpopular. She was seen as, and I am not kidding you, one newspaper called her a social climber with more political ambition than Lady Macbeth. I mean,
wow.
Yeah, it was harsh. I mean, she spent $10,000 on her inauguration gown, which is in like the American History Museum on the Mall, the Smithsonian. She spent oodles of money going to see the wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. She was concerned with, renovating the White House, updating its china, all while America was starting to go through a recession. And, no one wanted to see a rich lady take over the White House and not care about the well-being of the American people. Nancy Reagan needed an image change. She needed to be seen as maternal and caring and soft, as opposed to this sort of like gold digger that she appeared like in the beginning of her husband's administration. And by joining with the parent movement and by taking on the prevention of adolescent drug abuse as her primary platform, she was able to achieve that. So she essentially, she didn't steal the parent movement's platform. They gave it to her quite willingly. They loved having an advocate in the White House. It was a symbiotic relationship, beneficial for both sides. But nonetheless, it never would have happened if the parent movement hadn't already diagnosed the problem and began working against it 4 years before the Reagans even got elected.
And just a question about Nancy Reagan in particular. I'm not that familiar with her background. I know Reagan was an actor and then got his political start in California. But I remember hearing or reading somewhere that Nancy Reagan had much more experience in politics, or was much more politically driven initially than her husband, or something like that.
Yeah, there's definitely been some reports of that. She was an actor as well. They both came from Hollywood, although her career was more short-lived because she got married and then had kids and kind of stepped away from professional work to take care of family obligations. But that's kind of the reason why she was called this Lady Macbeth character. Some have argued that she really pushed Ronald into running for president because she had this political motivation and this desire to see him reach the greatest heights, that her ambition was what really drove him as opposed to his own ambition. Because he was he was one of the oldest presidents we've ever elected. There's definitely reports that he was senile by the time he left the White House and things like that. But for the most part, she was someone who, she took advantage of the things that came her way, and she could read a situation. She saw anti-drug abuse for what it was, which was an incredibly powerful and incredibly popular platform, and she went for it. So, good for her, I guess.
A savvy politician.
Indeed.
Yeah. So what did this now united parent movement and Reagan administration pushback look like in terms of legalization?
Well, they were able to overturn all of the decriminalization laws that were passed through a rather crafty method of ensuring that whatever block grants were going to states from the federal government for drug and alcohol abuse and prevention and treatment and education would only be given to states that had an overt discrimination policy against marijuana. So all of the states slowly and rather quietly began overturning the decriminalization laws that they had passed in the years prior. Any state staff was replaced by people who were overtly demonizing of marijuana. It became a situation where the laws against the drug were increased, right? But more than that, there was a social anxiety against the drug. And you could see that in popular culture, right? You could see that in popular sitcoms, especially ones that were directed at kids, like Punky Brewster, Different Strokes, all these different shows that had, I always forget the one that had like Trudy and, anyway, so there are all these different shows that had very special episodes about the dangers of marijuana, and they were prompted as, the dangers of drug abuse, but pot was always really the drug that was seen as the most dangerous, particularly to children. Nancy Reagan guest starred on, for example, Different Strokes. That was like a big thing. But there's this sort of national turn, policy-wise and pop culture-wise, that painted marijuana as the most dangerous drug that America was experiencing at the time because it posed the greatest threat to children. And the reason that this was basically allowed to happen was that the United States wasn't really abusing any other drugs at that time. The heroin epidemic from about 1967 to 1976 had abated. The crack crisis was still on the horizon. So there weren't a lot of other drugs being abused or being used at a very widespread level. Cocaine was gaining traction, but it was still kind of too expensive and things like that. So pot became enemy number one because that was the most visible drug of the time, and it was the one that the parent movement and the White House had actively put into the national imagination as the boogeyman of the era, excuse me.
And you mentioned that, for example, the earlier attempts or the earlier criminalization of marijuana had kind of a racial component or dimension to them. Was that as overt in the 1980s, or was it more subtle, or was it just not present, or?
Totally, kind of not, I would say. Marijuana it wasn't really seen as a white problem. It wasn't seen as a black problem. It was just sort of seen as a problem. But you saw a lot more white users, or the dangers it posed to white kids in popular culture and things like that. And for the most part, the people who were really supporting decriminalization laws in the 1970s and through the 80s, I mean, obviously they were quite quieted and sanctioned quite a bit, but they were still there, and they were mostly white people, right? So there's a reverse from that racialization of the drug in the early 20th century to the 1980s, where it's kind of seen as a drug that's a threat to nice white suburban kids. It's a drug that's being promoted by, white taxpayers. It loses that negative racialization, but it's not only white, right? Like Different Strokes starred prominent black actors, and they were also seen as being threatened by marijuana, and Nancy Reagan came in and saved them, and they were okay as well. So it lost that overt racialization, and it kind of became a sort of universal threat, and one that was particularly problematic, I guess, primarily because it seemed like such a threat to, nice white suburban families, middle class, paying their taxes, things like that.
One thing that I've definitely not my field, but I've heard that, for example, in the later movement to harshly penalize other drugs like crack cocaine, there was also a certain degree of cooperation with leaders of African American communities who saw it as a threat to their community. Is that kind of the same thing that happened with marijuana, or?
Yeah, it's something similar for sure. And you're totally right. So after crack kind of debuted on the national scene after Len Bias's overdose in June of 1986, and then there was the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 that September. That's the one that really criminalized crack, where 5 grams of crack cocaine, which is the equivalent of like a paperclip, a paperclip's worth of the drug, would earn a 5-year mandatory minimum in jail, whereas it would be 100 grams of powder cocaine, which was more expensive and generally going to a whiter, more affluent clientele, would earn you the equivalent of 5 years. So there were some really racialized, demonized aspects of the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. But again, those were targeting specifically crack cocaine and not marijuana. In that same legislation, you would have to have about 220 pounds of marijuana to get that same 5-year sentence. So mandatory minimum sentences are being written in this thing. They're being passed. They're being accepted. But the levels, or I guess one should say the amount of the drug that you had to have to warrant that each sentence were vastly different. But you're right in that there were a lot of African American leaders, social leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, things like that, who were coming down hard on crack as well. But what basically happened after 1986 was that, like, no one really thought about pot anymore. It became so secondary, and concerns about marijuana in the wake of crack cocaine seemed both like naive and charmingly innocent, right? Like, who cares about pot when like crack babies are being born and things like that? So it all kind of culminated in this large, passage of major drug legislation, but that racialization of drug use that you were talking about before kind of came to the forefront in 1986 because of crack, not because of marijuana.
And was the pushback against crack related solely to its impact on the community in terms of addiction and babies born addicted to crack cocaine, or was it violence as well?
It was both. I mean, it was sort of the perceived image of it as something that was particularly bad for families. It was called instantly addictive. There were all these warnings about crack babies that ended up being unfounded. And there was the fact that it was being shown as a drug that was being primarily used in the inner cities, which of course after white flight were mostly African American, and being used by a lower class population as well. I think class had a lot to do with it because crack was cheap, right? It's derived from powdered cocaine, but it's mixed with baking soda or some other composite to make it smokable, but also to make it less expensive. So you could buy crack for like $5 or $10 as opposed to powdered cocaine, which would cost, somewhat more. So it was going to a lower class, for the most part, non-white group of people in an urban population. And that's what really allowed people to view it as this expressly problematic drug. Which is just like, you think about it now and you're like, oh my God, really? That's what we did? We did that? Really? Oh, so awful.
Yeah, it's so despite the fact that they were both Schedule 1 drugs, the messaging and the supposedly endangered members of the community were very different.
Precisely. That's exactly it. Pot targeted nice suburban kids, whereas crack was the destruction of the nation because, it was exploding from inner cities, and it was just a matter of time, as many, news headlines reported, until it came into the nice areas. And all of a sudden, the entire country was addicted to this horrible substance, and it was all downhill from there.
And one of the big ways that a lot of states today, at least, are legalizing pot is through medical marijuana laws. When did those start picking up?
Medical marijuana is a really interesting transition from the legalization and decriminalization movement in the 1970s. And the first medical law was passed in 1996 in California. And it was specifically passed because it was tied to the gay rights and the AIDS movements out of that state, particularly out of San Francisco, that had a large number of AIDS victims and gay rights activists. So for the most part, because crack had kind of knocked marijuana from the headlines and it was no longer the national boogeyman, it was resurrected in the late 1980s as a potential panacea for the scores of people who were dying from a disease that no one really understood at the time, which we now understand as the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But it was being it was being sort of distributed by a series of activists, including Brownie Mary Rathbun and Dennis Perron, to people who were starting to succumb to the symptoms of HIV/AIDS. And it would give them an appetite. It would give them a little bit of strength. It would help control their nausea. And so kind of emerging out of that very dark moment of American history, the medical marijuana movement was born. And now it has spread to, I think last count was 29 states in Washington, D.C. And I think it has something crazy like 89% national approval, according to a Quinnipiac poll. It's really like people just think it's great, and I mean, it really does offer a lot of benefits. So as well, they should.
Yeah, I mean it's every couple of months it seems that there's some new report about how it's actually an excellent and minimally an excellent solution to X or Y issue with minimal side effects.
Yeah, it's remarkable, the number of things that it's being used to treat, even without a real panoply of scientific evidence for it. Because marijuana remains a Schedule I drug, it's incredibly hard to do a lot of research on its medical effects because the federal government insists that it has no medical benefits whatsoever, and yet states are starting to recognize its value. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and they just passed medical marijuana in 2016, and the first dispensaries just started opening, including one close to my hometown. And there was a guy who was in a horrible car accident, and his back is just it's broken beyond repair. He's in a wheelchair. He experiences a lot of chronic pain. And because he does not want to use opioid painkillers, because he does not want to go down that path, he was the first person in line when the dispensary opened last week, and he bought $500 worth of CBD products. And the newspapers reported, they asked him like, well, how long is this going to last you? And he said, it's going to get me through about a month, but it's worth it. So there are states, even like Pennsylvania, that are starting to recognize that this drug not only has medical value, but there's also a lot of potential for, tax benefits, for decreasing the number of people arrested for it, for bringing them out of the criminal justice system, and for putting them into a medical system. So it's kind of remarkable how that has happened in 22 years. It's gone very fast.
Yeah. And it seems to be just catching even more momentum, even though under the current administration, it does not seem to have much support at the federal level.
Yeah.
When we see a kind of the end of this period of new attempts to restrict marijuana control under the Reagan administration, and we see a kind of, when do we start to see a return to momentum among the movements to legalize or decriminalize pot?
That gained some real traction, I would say, in 2010 with the publication of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. This book really kind of took America by storm. I remember reading an article about how its publishers only wanted to print like 3,000 copies, but then I think it sold like 175,000 since. So, good
Wow.
for Michelle Alexander, right? Like it's this really momentous book that talked about how the criminalization of nonviolent offenses, including drug offenses, particularly for substances like marijuana, had essentially resegregated America by turning Black and brown people into drug criminals, into criminals for nonviolent crimes. And as soon as they were criminals, it was okay to incarcerate them. It was okay to take them out of mainstream society. And it was okay to force their families into that sort of continued suffering that long-term incarceration brings on, right? A person who is incarcerated, a felon, doesn't get housing benefits. They can't vote. They can't serve on a jury, right? There's all these really negative effects from that come from having been incarcerated for a felony, and they affect not only the former felon themselves, but their families and things like that for generations to come. So Alexander picks up on this and realizes that the United States is currently incarcerating more of its Black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid, and says, like, holy smokes, something terrible is going on. We have to work on this.
Wait, sorry to interrupt you. Do you mean in absolute terms or in relative terms, or both?
In relative terms, I think. She's talking about like percentage wise, yeah. But she's seen, she's reporting, like, the more research she does. She was a lawyer for the ACLU of California at the time. Now she's a law professor at Ohio State. But she started digging into numbers and realizing that, like, 1/3 of Black American males were in some form of the incarceration system, whether they're on parole or things like that. And it was just a really stunning realization that America had turned Jim Crow style segregation away from overt labeling of, water fountains and things like that into this sort of quiet mass incarceration of our Black population that still kept Blacks and whites away from each other, but did so under the veil of criminality. And she thought that was incredibly problematic, and she is correct, right? So she publishes this book. The book really makes a big splash. And although she never overtly says that legalization is the answer, a lot of social justice activists pick up on what she's saying and see legalization as at least one concrete step that could be taken to level the playing field a little bit, because Blacks are arrested between 4 and 20 times more often, depending on where you are in the country, than whites are for marijuana, which is a drug that, most reports say that people use in equal numbers, regardless of race, class, gender, and things like that. So legalization gets picked up in this larger social justice movement for equality, for egalitarianism, for Black Lives Matter, for things like that. And that's where you see the push for overt recreational legalization that has swept now through 9 states in Washington, D.C. since 2012.
So where do you see the, under the current administration and, well, at least, and beyond the current administration, where do you see this movement going forward?
Well, it's interesting, right? I have a lot of friends who work for the federal government. They work for congressional representatives and things like that. And they have all told me that despite America's increasing acceptance of the drug, there's no way Congress would reschedule it. The movement's just not that powerful. I mean, we can't even outlaw automatic rifles, and 17 kids just got killed in Florida. Like we can't, if we're not going to outlaw semi-automatic rifles, we're probably not going to legalize marijuana anytime soon. But there's no movement on the federal level to reschedule or deschedule marijuana. So it's up to the states to kind of take laws into their own hands. Now, medical marijuana laws are increasingly popular. They still run into problems. There are still states that have voter initiative or citizen initiative, but the legislature is not willing to pass it. Recreational legalization is kind of another animal entirely. For the most part, all recreational laws, except for that in Vermont, have been passed through ballot initiative. And ballot initiatives are only available in less than half of the states. So if people in places like New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania want to pass recreational legalization, they have to go through the state legislature, which is oftentimes slower moving and more conservative than states with ballot measures. So it's going to be a bit of an uphill climb. And then, of course, even for states that have legalization measures on their dockets, there's still issues. I mean, it's still federally illegal. For example, in Maine, which voted to legalize in 2016, Governor LePage has vetoed and blocked the bill, so there's no implementation of it yet. It's in no way a totally smooth problem-free road ahead, which I think is something that any activist working for legalization really has to keep in mind. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people still really committed to the cause and still really working for it. And each state that has passed a legalization law seems to be improving on the ones that came before. California, which legalized in 2016 and just opened its first dispensaries this year, they're also expunging people's records for marijuana crimes that occurred prior to legalization, which is a huge, very important step. They're limiting how much people can grow, so fears of big marijuana are mediated. And there's a lot of things that states are doing to try to console people who are opposed to legalization and remedy their fears. But it's I always think that declarations of marijuana's legal status are premature. We should not believe that it is going to be legal forever starting tomorrow. And I think people who are activists either for or against the drug have a lot of work still ahead of them, and things are just going to keep changing no matter who's in the White House and no matter what happens.
My understanding of one of the major structural problems facing the current, the decriminalization in many parts of the country, and even vendors of marijuana right now, is that they have difficulties putting their money in banks because banks are subject to federal law, and the banks are worried that the assets will be seized or they'll be fined or something.
Exactly. Banking is a huge problem. Banks are, of course, controlled by the FDIC, so they're, forced to abide by federal regulations, and they don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time dealing with a drug that is federally illegal. In the same way, growers are coming across the same problems because marijuana can't apply for federal crop insurance. So the wildfires that raged across Northern California late last year, they destroyed millions of dollars of cannabis, and those farmers can't get anything back for their lost crops. So it's like going into legal pot is an incredible financial gamble. and that's why you see a lot of venture capitalists in California going into it, because, they're used to losing money and they kind of recognize that as part of the fact of doing business. But smaller people, like the mom and pop shops, who maybe can't afford the licensing fees or paying the enormous amount of taxes, in that way, it's still a very volatile and somewhat dangerous market to enter into, because you don't have the same level of assurances, and literal insurance that, growing soybeans or corn would have.
And how are you very familiar with the decriminalization efforts or projects in Portugal?
A little bit. I'm familiar in the respect that I think Portugal has decriminalized all drug use, right? Is that how it's going?
I'm pretty sure it affects marijuana and heroin at the very least. I'm not sure how much further it goes.
Right, but the idea that if you decriminalized use, and you sort of got people into treatment as opposed to, locking them up, that's not a bad idea. And you see a moderate embrace of this idea in some places across America because of the opioid abuse epidemic. So I know Philadelphia has the first safe injection site in the country. Canada is doing a lot of work with things like that. So there is this belief that, okay, so we have marijuana decriminalized, legalized, or medically available in some parts of the country. The opioid abuse epidemic is a huge issue. We need to start doing things that actually treat people who are dealing with these drug issues, as opposed to only criminalizing them and only incarcerating them, because it's becoming more widely known that is not in any way, shape, or form a solution to America's drug problem.
As a kind of more of a historiographical analysis, what would you say are some of the kind of major voids or obstacles in your field to really understanding the process of legalization and criminalization of marijuana in American history? And what are some of the recent advances in your field that have really opened it up?
Oh, that's a great question. I think people are doing some really great work. I was just at the American Historical Association's conference in January of this year. It was in DC, so I was able to go, and I chaired a panel on a lot of really fascinating current marijuana historical research, and people are trying to understand how and why and where this drug was used from, the beginnings of time, right? They're really trying to figure out how, the role that this drug has played in American history, in transnational history, in histories. It's just fascinating the work that people are doing. I'm incredibly proud of the people I know in the Alcohol and Drugs History Society. So David Korostovsky, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Bob Beach. There's just great people, Mike Durfee's doing good work. There's just people who are, I'm gloating over them because I'm so proud of all of my colleagues. But alcohol and drug history, I feel like, is really starting to come into its own. People are recognizing that by looking at America's intoxicant use, we actually have a pretty interesting lens through which to view personal, cultural, political, transnational experiences that America has had at home and abroad. And I couldn't be prouder of the work that people are putting together. I feel as though, obviously there are a lot of holes in the field because it's relatively young, but there are so many talented and intellectual and engaged historians who are attacking it that it's just going to get better and better. It's very exciting.
That's great to hear. So, Dr. Emily Dufton, she is the author of Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for coming on.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.